So thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by our Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman Center in partnership with the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. This is actually our second webinar of this academic year, very exciting, so thank you for joining us. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BEAR, as some of you know, is a group of research faculty from across the core disciplinary areas here at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and we have three programmatic missions. Those are to research, to educate, and to engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. And these monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners that are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral science, policy, and research. So we are delighted today to have Faisal Naru as a senior economic advisor from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD here. Before I introduce you, Faisal, I would like to just go briefly over the ground rules for this webinar. So following this introduction, Faisal will deliver a 30 to 40-minute presentation, and during this presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all of our participants here, and at the end of the talk, and with the time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which Patrick will select the questions from the chat tab to ask our speaker. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Faisal Naru. I've actually met Faisal, and I looked it up this morning, about 3 years ago when I was invited to give a talk at the OECD in Paris in September 2014. So Faisal, it's amazing. 3 years have just flew by like this, and a lot has happened in those 3 years, and some of which we will hear from Faisal today. So Faisal is a senior economic advisor in the Public Governance and Territorial Development Directorate of the OECD. He manages a team that has a wide portfolio that works with public administrations and institutions internationally on topics including behavioral insights, but also regulatory policy and government, digital government and ICT, and institutional change. Faisal is also responsible for work in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and is responsible for a number of OECD publications and guidelines. He established and is the lead for the OECD network of economic regulators, which works with CEOs and commissioners of regulatory agencies to define what it means to be a world-class regulator. And his latest work describes how organizations can maintain their independence and protect themselves from undue influence. Faisal is a former member of the UK Cabinet Office and also worked in other government departments for several years. He was a chief advisor to the government of Vietnam on economic and regulatory reforms. And prior to that, he set up and was head of the policy and regulatory reform practice, as well as being on the leadership board for global development consultancy, working in Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Europe on particular, I believe, public sector change and performance improvement. So you have done a lot. This will be really super exciting and interesting to hear of your current work. And so thanks, Faisal, for being here today, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Nina. And thank you very much for the very flattering introduction. Yeah, it makes me feel old when you go through all those different things. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this webinar on myth-busting behavioral science across the world. And the work I'm going to present is the work that's been done by myself, but also in conjunction with my colleague Filippo Cavazzini and a few others as well, including James Drummond and Winona and Anna, and there's a whole team that's working on lots of these different things that I'm going to present on. But before I start, I think this week has been a very special week, and I'd like to give special congratulations to Richard Thaler for winning the Nobel Prize. If you didn't know this, where were you? Which is fantastic, and I think it's a bit of a defining moment. And we'll discuss a bit more about some of these things, but first I did want to give congratulations to Richard. Then I'm going to be presenting work that has been going on in the OECD since 2012, and actually since around the time that Nina and I first met, when she was invited over to the OECD to do some seminars, and since then it's kind of snowballed on, and there's a variety of pieces that I'm going to be speaking about here. Not all of them, but most of them. And I'm going to try and go through three main things in this particular webinar. The first thing is myth busting. The second is begin to speak a bit about what is actually going on and why. And what I'd really like to focus actually quite a bit of this seminar on is on the what's next. I believe that those people that are tuned into this are from various different backgrounds, and you're probably operating in this field. And I think that there's lots of things to think about. And I'd like to probably present some ideas to try and provoke, I think, future work and some kind of, I guess, reaction to what should be happening in the future. So firstly, myth busting. I'll go through this quite quickly, but this is mainly based upon this publication, which I'm sure many of you have seen or have heard about. This came out in earlier on this year, and this was our large collection of what is going on across the world in relation to behavioural insights and public policy. And it's worth probably saying within here, I guess we're defining behavioural insights with three key attributes. The first is that it is introducing behavioural and social sciences into public policy, and that includes a variety of different disciplines, including decision making and psychology and cognitive science, neuroscience, organisational and group behaviour. And that, I think, is really now beginning to become more and more so the essence of behavioural insights, being an entry point for lots of these different disciplines to be able to enter into the public policy field, which traditionally it wasn't. The second thing is around experimentation, that behavioural insights is really trying to embed a culture of experimentation into public policy itself. And the third and final thing that I'd say is that it tries to introduce the inductive approach to policy making, which ultimately is about debiasing the policy making process. And that is to say that instead of coming up with a hypothesis based upon evidence, or sometimes biases as well as evidence, and then trying to prove that particular theory is right, and this, we are talking about policymakers here, or trying to say that particular intervention is right. This is more about inducing the evidence to show what the problem actually is, and then what are the types of interventions that could address some of these issues. So those are three key distinctions that I wanted to make at the beginning. So let's go into the myths now. So myth one, that behavioural insights is just a fad, it's just a fashion, and it's only being applied in a few countries. Well, I think clearly our work and the case studies that we collected shows that it's not, and that we have case studies from all over the world, from places such as Costa Rica and Colombia, to Zambia, to Kenya, to Singapore, to all kinds of different places. So that certainly is something that we hope has been demonstrated to not necessarily be the case. And I think, again, recognition this week by the Nobel Prize Committee, I think, goes further, I think, also to demonstrate this. Myth number two, that behavioural insights is just for the scientists. It's just for the people who are really interested in behavioural science, and they're the main people that are driving this inside institutions and organisations. Well, that's not the case. What we found was that actually it was rather the leadership that were requiring or were asking for behavioural science to be used. And again, we'll come on to why is that the case, and why is this happening in public policy as a whole, and why is it that leadership is playing a great role in demanding that the application of behavioural insights is applied. Myth number three is that behavioural insights is always steered from the centre. Well, what we found was three models which are being used in public bodies. Firstly, there is the model of having a central steering unit for behavioral insights across the entire government apparatus. But then we also have instances of having a diffuse model, whereby you have different units in different ministries or different public bodies that are conducting work on behavioral insights. And then finally, you have project-based work, which is where there are specialized teams that are set up for a specific issue or a specific problem that needs to be addressed. And none of these have to only exist. In many cases, there's much coexistence of this, and sometimes it is the case that it starts off with a central steering unit, and in other cases, it starts off with multiple units that are working on this, and then the central unit comes afterwards. And there are different ways that this has been institutionalized inside public bodies. The next myth is on ethics is a big barrier, and we hear this quite a lot, that immediately people say, well, the ethics of using behavioral science inside public bodies is a huge concern and needs to be carefully managed. Well, what we found was that actually ethical concerns weren't one of the major issues for applying behavioral insights inside public bodies. What we found was that the existing ethical frameworks that governments or regulatory agencies had, they were often using them themselves in order to steer this and in order to implement behavioral insights, as opposed to coming up with new ethics. But we will come back to the issue of ethics a bit later on. Behavioral insights is too expensive. To be honest, I think here there's some more work to be done. I mean, we didn't really find much evidence here because, I mean, like you can see, there was generally a lot of no responses on the reported costs of applying behavioral insights. But I think there are instances, I think, for instance, in the UK Behavioural Insights team and their pledge in their early days to have a return on investment, if you like, of tenfold, it shows that there are I guess small costs to this or smaller costs to this, but in relation to the output that you can have, it's certainly worth the investment. But I think this is an area where there's probably some further research that's going to be required. Myth number 6 is that behavioural insights is really used, and we didn't find this to be the case. We find that behavioural insights is being used quite a bit. Yes, it's not being used systemically, but I think we can come back to that issue a bit later on. But it is being used, and it's being used quite a lot across different governments. And myth number 7 is that behavioural insights is just applied to some sectors. Well, what we found, and you will see in the publication, that there's a number of different sectors where this is applied. Yes, financial products and the financial sector is a place where there's been lots of work that's been done, particularly on financial education after the financial crisis. But in health and safety or labour market reform or even public administration reform, there are lots of examples of where behavioural insights is being applied, and you'll see on the screen here lots of other areas where it's actually being applied. And myth number 8 is that behavioural insights only involves randomized controlled trials. Now, randomized controlled trials being the gold standard, if you like, for conducting behavioural experimentation, is certainly the most popular here. But it's interesting here to see that the second most popular actually here is, if you like, the other end of the spectrum, where there's simply literature reviews done and key knowledge diffusion from the literature on behavioural insights is also being used. I think we're increasingly now seeing more other methods being used, such as lab experiments or surveys which are behaviourally informed or behaviourally proofed. But there are a number of different methods to use when applying behavioural insights. So those are the myths. Now, what is going on? Well, this is work in progress, so you're the first people to see this. But this is a mapping exercise of the different institutions that we certainly at the OECD are in contact with and in touch with and have been, who are working on behavioural insights across the world. And you see the amount that are there. We've counted 130 odd. A recent paper by Cass Sunstein and Lucia Reich also quotes that there's over 150 different governments now applying behavioural insights. But here we're trying to have a look at what are the institutions that are looking that have actually been set up. So apart from the projects where we know that governments are certainly using behavioural insights, what are the actual institutional settings here? And you can see that there really are all over the world, and they are increasing as well. And you have the different models of having them inside government, but also having outside government and having multinational organisations working on behavioural insights as well. And behavioural insights is mostly applied at the implementation stage of the policy cycle, which you can see here. But one of the things that we've said in the report in particular is that behavioural insights is really being applied earlier on in the process, when either there is evaluation being conducted or when there is some kind of design or strategy setting for a particular policy area. And we think that there should be a lot more work done in there, and that is beginning to happen as well. I mean, it's fair to say that this field is fast moving, and even since when we collected the case studies up until now, there have been lots of changes and lots of improvements that have happened. I think an important thing to say here about the why. I mean, why is it that government's looking into this? And I think it has to be about evidence. And it is true that lots of public institutions, they already collect evidence, but the key question here is that evidence being collected, is it biased or is it not? And this is a great quote by Werner Heisenberg, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics and is known for being the creator of quantum mechanics, who says that what we observe is not nature itself, but rather nature exposed to our particular method of questioning. And that's very much, I think, the case that is being realized inside many public bodies and public institutions, is that they want evidence and they want intelligence, they want information in order to make decisions. But increasingly, there is almost a search for trying to find out how what methods can be used in order to really find out what that evidence is and what do people really think and how will people really behave after they have implemented a particular policy or a particular intervention. And that comes on to another important point about the application of behavioural insights, and that's around trust, and that's around evidence and engagement. Now, trust is at the heart of this, that this, in trying to apply behavioural insights, there has to be a certain element of trust inside the public bodies for there to be able to be used, because there can be some kind of, I guess, notion from certain quarters that should governments really be doing this, and can we trust them with applying psychology to the public and things like that. However, what I'd say here is that we're distinctly seeing in the governance field, I think we're distinctly seeing, I guess, a retraction from what is a typical or a more traditional or a previous, I don't know what kind of word you want to use, but the governance model that tries to have some kind of command and control, tries to have a certain amount of prescription and permission based, and likes to operate in an area of full certainty. And this, I think, is something which lots of public bodies, given the way that the world is moving so fast, how dynamic things are, the digital world, progress in data and data science and things like that, means that actually what we're getting now, I think, and where governance is moving and where governments and regulatory agencies are moving towards, is more towards collaboration, more towards governance and prohibition of red line issues only. So, for instance, to say that, we don't mind what happens in the market, but as long as these critical things don't happen, like, for instance, people aren't harmed or people aren't killed, or there are certain things are protected. And also being comfortable in moving into an era of sure uncertainty, of being able to be proactive enough to be able to say that we, the public body, do not know everything, and we shouldn't be expected to, because nobody does. However, we have the tools, we have the ability, and we are managing that risk, and we are managing that uncertainty, and we are governing with that in mind. And I think that's quite a change that's happening, and I think behavioural insights is part of this change that is happening inside governments. So what's next here? Well, we had a meeting in May in Paris where we discussed some of these things with I think there's over 150 behavioural practitioners and academics and leading experts coming together to have a closed door meeting about what is going on at the moment. And I'd like to maybe touch upon a few of the key insights that we had from that particular meeting. The first that was being articulated, I think, at the meeting is that context really matters, and that the application of behavioural science in different places means that there are different appetites, political appetites, cultural appetites, to the extent to which behavioural science can be applied in those particular countries. So it might be that in some countries debiasing is fine, and for trying to debias consumer information, for instance. In other instances, it may be perfectly fine to actually use the biases in order to get some kind of outcome. And in other instances, in another country context, it might be fine to a notion called boosting, or to have some kind of cognitive empowerment, which is to say that as opposed to changing the choice architecture, actually having some kind of interaction that builds the capacity or the cognitive ability of people themselves is perfectly fine. Now, of course, in some instances, that's not going to be palatable in different country contexts. And that's why context certainly matters for how behavioural insights is being applied, and certainly how it will be applied in the future. The other thing here, I think, is that and this was well articulated as well, is that ultimately behavioural insights is trying to help people or organisations make better decisions, and there are a variety of different ways of trying to do that. But the key question here is, who decides what are better decisions? What kind of criteria will there be for when a decision is actually a better decision in itself? This is something that public bodies should be looking into a bit more. We at the OECD are going to be working on some of these things with some leading experts across different places, like for instance, Dr. Pete Lunn and a few others that we've worked with in the past as well, to try and begin to understand a bit more about this and try to come up with some kind of framework for public bodies to start to think about these different questions that they're going to have to make. But of course, a very good mantra, which again goes back to Richard Thaler and of course the work that Cass Sunstein has been doing, which is nudge for good. But again, public bodies are going to have to at some point begin to think about, well, how are they going to be defining good, and what are going to be the parameters within which they allow this to develop further. I mentioned before that ethics isn't necessarily a huge issue. However, I think that the meeting that we had, where we had lots of conversation and lots of good input, I think from various different people, including from BEAR and from BSPA as well, is that at some point there is going to have to be some kind of work on an ethical framework for public policy applying behavioural insights. And this is something to safeguard, I think, the behavioural community itself. That the behavioural community itself should get together in order to do this kind of work, and in order to start to have some kind of a framework, if not because of decisions by policymakers, legislatures and politicians on whether and how to intervene is going to be very important. But one of the things that was also quite clear, I think, from the meeting is that what can the behavioural community do? Well, one of the things that we could say that it's there to do is to provide impartial, objective and tested evidence, and be socially responsible in the scientific advice that is given in public policy decision making. And that's something that I think we're going to be working with. We're looking forward to. We've already started actually working with Dr. Pelle Hansen from Denmark in relation to some of these issues there as well, and the toolkit. So these are things that we're certainly very interested in, and would certainly be interested in if anybody else has ideas in these particular areas. And probably the other thing that I'd say here is for those initiatives that are set up inside public bodies is to try and avoid the silo effect. I think one of the big advantages of the application of behavioural economics, behavioural science, behavioural insights has been the fact that it is merging different disciplines together, primarily psychology and economics, but now also some of the other disciplines as well. And in relation to that, it should continue in that particular vein of being multidisciplinary in its real essence, so that it doesn't suffer, I think, what many good innovative initiatives in government institutions suffer from, which is the silo effect, which is whereby they become, they don't necessarily adhere to that multidisciplinary approach. I mean, when we did some of the work that we've done in some countries, that's one of the things that we try and do. We try and have, a behavioural scientist, economists, maybe data scientists, maybe, competition experts or regulatory experts or whatever it is, all sit around the table together in order to solve some of these key issues. And I think that's behavioural science can certainly contribute to moving forward. Now, some ideas I'd like to throw out there, I think, is on where next for the application of behavioral science. And I think in particular, this is, I think, a bit of a calling for researchers as well as public institutions to come together and to start to think about some of these different things. So if we think about changing behavior, for instance, and we think about things like sustainable development, or we think about energy efficiency or water efficiency, there's been lots of work that's been done in relation to having the right kind of information and labeling being put forward for consumers and customers to be able to make the right kind of decisions, to buy refrigerators which consume less energy or other types of things. I think something that'd be quite interesting is going beyond information, but into actual things like pricing. And using behavioural insights in order to actually begin to look into some of the pricing issues, and because we know that yes, to a certain extent, pricing is a mathematical calculation. However, we also know that simply trying to put everything into a price won't necessarily work, and there are numerous examples of it. And here's an example from Ontario where actually some of these thoughts are beginning to take place, which is that if we do, for instance, want to improve people's usage of energy and moving them from off-peak to on-peak times and things like that, what kind of pricing methodologies can you come up with? I mean, we're doing some very interesting work at the moment also with Scotland in relation to pricing for water. And again, this comes down to behaviours, and there will have to be behavioural evidence put into the mix of that mathematical calculation of what the prices should be for water itself. So there's some work that's happening, but I think I'd like to see more work in relation to this. And another thing that I'd like to say in relation to this is some of this could potentially move towards, and this goes back to the multidisciplinary approach, which is starting to view interventions, public policy interventions, more from a user-centric perspective, or from, as you can see here, from a lifestyle perspective, which is where we put people at the center of this, and then afterwards we start to think about, well, what are the types of interventions that can work? Because when people wake up in the morning, they don't necessarily wake up in the morning and think, right, I need to use less water when I have my shower. They're simply thinking, right, I need to get out and get onto and get into work or get to school or whatever it is in time. And they're not necessarily thinking about those things. But if we start to think about people in terms of their lifestyles, and again, we're here at the OECD, we're working together with UNEP and a few others. to start to look into some of these different issues, and that includes also work with the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, and there'll be some papers coming out fairly soon that begin to bring, I think, some of these different things together to try and identify how behavioural insights can really start to help change behaviour in this context in terms of human consumption. Another area that I think is quite interesting and important is going to be the digital world and people, and the interaction between the two. Now there's already quite a lot of thinking that's gone into this, but I think it's been around things like, well, how is information being provided to people in the digital world? When is the information being provided? But I think the key question that should be asked more is, why is the information being given? Because there's lots of information that is given to people if you go online and if you're doing lots of different transactions or buying things or just simply engaging there. There's lots of different types of information that's given, whether it's terms and conditions or business or retail information or supply information or customer feedback. Or also search engines as well, and they're all giving you different types of intervention. But I think there's some kind of space here for further work in relation to the data that is there, the behaviours that maybe public policy wants to encourage by consumers, but then also the back end of that, which is around data and data management itself. And I think, for instance, here is a very good example. I mean, in 2006. In the Netherlands, the regulator there issued a cookie clause opinion. Now, according to the European Privacy Directive, everybody must make an informed permission to collect user data. So I'm sure all of you know this. Every time you go on a website, you get a sign coming up saying that cookies, i.e. information, is being collected about you, and you click on whether you want to accept that or not. Well, the regulator there did some work, and it tried to have a look at, well, what are the business burdens of this particular clause of having cookies? Well, the one-off cost for businesses is 74 million euros per annum. In order to maintain that cookie clause, it's 7.1 million euros. And if we look at the user burdens, if they just simply click and say, okay, that's fine, I'm not going to read the terms and conditions, it's 27 million euros per annum. But if they do actually read the terms and conditions, it's 1.6 billion euros per annum. Now, again, I think thinking about, well, if anybody's like me, and I hope that isn't the case for you, is that you rarely read any of that. And you're not really paying much attention to that. I mean, I simply click yes, 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 yes every time I have that cookie clause on there. So it starts to beg the question, well, what is that really there for? And I think it's those kind of things. I think that if the purpose here is for people to have an informed, to make an informed decision and provide permission to collect user data, it's not really doing that. And surely there has to be better ways which could be behaviourally informed in order to meet that end objective itself. Now, here's a good example from the European Commission's 2011 Consumer Rights Directive, where behavioural science was used in order to stop defaulting online for when people purchase things. So, for instance, this here is a snapshot of me buying a ticket and being asked whether or not I wanted to have insurance on there. Now, previously, before this directive came out, it would be pre-ticked for me, and I may or may not have noticed it, and may or may not have paid for it. However, now there's an active decision that I have to make, and I can say yes or no to whether or not I want to pay for extra insurance in this case for buying a travel ticket. But it was used in many different ways in terms of defaulting. And I think defaults again is going to be very important, I think, in relation to the digital world and its interaction with people itself. And finally, I think I probably want to talk about organisational behaviour and the fact that there is this, I think, is an area that is of great interest to public bodies about how to change organisational behaviour. That and that's institutions, that's regulators themselves, and regulated entities. And there's lots of work that can go on in relation to this, and we're doing some of this work here at the OECD. And in particular, I'd just like to highlight this piece, which is we looked at how to create an organisational culture of independence. And what we showed here is that there are certain pinch points, if you like, in the life of a regulatory agency where they come under particular influence, or undue influence as we like to call it, in relation to their financing. So what we found, for instance, through one of the research that we did, is that of all of those regulatory agencies that get their funding directly from the ministry or from government, I think if I remember correctly, it's about 86% of them were all on one-year budgets. Now, what does that mean? Structurally speaking, what does that mean for an organization's culture and the way that it behaves if every year its finances are not certain? Well, it means it can't necessarily, in this case, develop a full culture of independence. And I think that there's more work to be done in relation to this area of organizational culture, and applying behavioral insights into how to change organizations internally, but also then how they interact with others as well. I'm running out of time, so I wanted to end this webinar with a very quick story, and this is a bit of an untold story of how we launched the report back in on behavioural insights and public policy from around the world, and how we did this early on this year. We actually applied behavioural insights to our launch itself. So the first thing we did is that we wanted to make sure that the launch was global. And so we launched it in 7 different time zones in one day. We started off in Australia and New Zealand and ended up on the west coast of the United States. And we chose times that were suitable for each of those different time scales. It was green. It was a green launch. We didn't print any publications at the launch. We had a zero carbon footprint or any other kind of footprint from physical events and costs that we did, because everything was done online. And importantly, it was behaviourally informed. What we decided was that people have busy lives, and we can only, if we did a physical event, we can only crowd a certain amount of people into the room to afford time to leave and to be able to come and come to this launch. So instead, we thought, and we'd have a short, tailored, and fun videos that would launch the report, and the entire video itself wouldn't last more than 5 minutes. We figured 5 minutes was probably around the right time, and you can see all of these videos online. And finally, that it was relevant. The report itself, the reason why we did this was that back in 2015 we had our first closed door meeting of behavioural practitioners, and there it was quite clear there was a call, if you like, for the OECD to collect a global picture of what is going on in public institutions and behavioural insights. And so we made sure that the report responded to that need in itself. Now, what was the result of this? Well, the result of this was that when we only did a 2-week Twitter campaign, and then we did the launch itself. Throughout that campaign, we had, the way we measured this was that we had 500 hits on our website, around 500 hits on our website per day. On the day of the launch itself, we had about 2,000 hits on our website, and that compares to previously, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say this, we'd probably get, from January 2017, we averaged about 25 hits a day on our website. So it worked, but I think it shows that not only by using behavioural insights in public policies and public institutions are we at the OECD certainly trying to look at some of these key issues, but we're also trying to implement it in some of the things that we do on a regular basis itself, in order to improve some of the things that we do and have better outcomes for the objectives that we have as well. So that's almost the end. The final thing that I'd say is that you can see here on the screen some posters or postcards which we have now developed and will soon be available online for people to download and to print. And they give some examples of the report itself and certain case studies and feel free to take them and print them and to do whatever you like with them. So thank you very much for listening. If you want to carry on listening, here are information on what's going on and what will be happening, and happy to take any questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I am going to now hand over to Patrick.
Okay.
Can you hear us now, Patrick? Yeah.
I can. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. The technical difficulties have been overcome. Awesome. So thank you so much, Faisal, and thanks, Nina, for jumping in there when technology failed me. So we have a few questions that have been submitted via our chat box. If anyone else has any additional questions, please put them in the chat box. So the first question kind of is a combination of a few questions about how behavioral insights are being implemented with transparency or not.
Mm-hmm.
So one question is saying, for example, one participant noted that the UK Behavioural Insights team was partially privatized, and how that might, how would that kind of impact the transparency mandate that we're looking for in behaviorally informed policy. And one participant noted that there's concerns of mind control, quote unquote, and how can we make the actual intentions and functions of behavioral science policymakers clear? So I guess we'd like to hear a little bit more about transparency. Faisal, are you there? Okay, it seems like we're having some technical difficulties here. So we'll wait a few minutes for Faisal to join us again.
No, everyone can. So it seems that he's trying, that his sound is supposedly on.
Okay.
Let's see, can we text him? Send him a message.
Okay.
I think he's going to rejoin.
Okay. Okay. So while we wait for Faisal to rejoin, I guess we'll kind of go towards the things that we'll say in the conclusion. So just to kind of let you all know, a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website. In order to get to it, you can click on the side tab labeled Events, and then click the sub-tab labeled the Bear Webinar Series. There won't be slides, but we will have the full recording available. So Faisal should be able to join us back momentarily. So thanks for your patience. Myself. So I think we'll wrap up here. I think Faisal has encountered some issues with his internet connection. So I'm very sorry about that. I'm sorry that he couldn't do a Q&A here. But I'd like to thank Nina for guest introducing. And I'd also like to thank Faisal for leading our webinar today. As I said prior, a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events, and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. For any questions that you may have, you can send the questions to us, so to either Liz or myself, and you should have an email inviting you to this webinar that has our email addresses on it. So if you have any questions that you'd like answered, please send them to us, and we will forward them to Faisal. Just to remind you all, as our slides say right now, our next webinar will be November 9th, and we will hear from Professor Sonia Kang from Rotman's Organizational Behavior area. And she'll be presenting on the behavioral science of identity and stereotypes. Sorry again for the technical issues. Thanks Faisal again, and thanks Nina, and thank you all for attending. So this will conclude this webinar, and you can exit this webinar now by closing your WebEx screen. And thank you again.